Hey, peace. Thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. Before we air today's episode, which is an interview with Willy Lee, who is challenging Andrew Johnson for the Ward 12 City Council seat in Minneapolis, I have to talk about the murder, the execution by law enforcement of Winston Smith, which took place on Thursday, June 3rd, on the top of a parking ramp in broad daylight in the busy uptown neighborhood of Minneapolis. Winston Smith was a father, a talented and well-loved comedian, a musician, and a revolutionary-minded black man. Winston Smith was murdered by officers participating in a multi-jurisdictional U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force, which includes federal marshals, state troopers, and MPD officers. The MPD in this task force initially put forward the false claim that Winston was a murder suspect, and the lapdog, Republican billionaire-owned Star Tribune immediately published these false claims, poisoning the well and attempting to justify this murder. The authorities now claim Winston had a warrant for the possession of a firearm with a felony. Either way, Winston Smith should be alive today. This task force seems to have tracked Winston through his social media to Stella's Fish Cafe, where he was enjoying a meal with a woman, and ambushed and executed him. No due process, no right to a trial, no right to innocence until proven guilty. He was murdered in a matter of minutes upon officers arriving at the scene. We still haven't learned the names of the officers involved in this execution. The authorities are claiming there's no dash cam footage and no body camera footage. We've also seen a suppression of news about Winston Smith's murder on social media platforms. Twitter and Instagram are both burying posts about Winston Smith, and the story is not being picked up by national accounts and national outlets. It must be known that this same U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force was working with local authorities in Portland last summer and executed activist Michael Reinhold. Trump can be seen at a rally bragging about this execution, confirming witness accounts who say task force officers ambushed Reinhold, speeding up to his location and opening fire before announcing themselves or attempting arrest. Michael Reinhold was wanted for questioning in a self-defense shooting of a right-wing vigilante during a night of white supremacist attacks in Portland. Michael Reinhold was an active anti-racist. Winston Smith was expressing a revolutionary desire for justice and freedom in the weeks and months before his death. He was articulating the need for black people, oppressed people, everyone who was sick and tired of the police murdering in our city and state, to accept nothing less than justice, telling us that we could not ask passively for our right to life, that we must stand up and take it. The circumstances under which Winston Smith was killed by the same federal task force as Michael Reinhold, the coordinated disinformation campaign from the MPD and Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, all this leads you to think this was a deliberate execution, an assassination by a federal hit squad of a bright light and popular voice in the Twin Cities movement and community. Winston Smith should be alive today, continuing to live as the great father and uplifting artist that he was. My heart goes out to Winston's family and to Winston's friends. We cannot allow Winston's murder to get swept under the rug. We must not allow the state to kill without consequence. Say Winston Smith's name. Share his story. Talk about it at your workplace and in your family. Get in the streets. Shut down the economy of the city. Keep showing love to yourself and to each other. Keep making your comedy videos. Keep being a father, a mother, an auntie, a brother. Do whatever you can to support the youth who are keeping the fight innovative and aggressive and dynamic against this racist monster. Find ways to contribute your energy and talent and time to the effort to reshape this society in a revolutionary way. Stand up and take justice. I recorded the interview that is today's episode a couple weeks ago, but I couldn't come into your feed without addressing this real-time situation and saying the name of Winston Smith. While I'm here, I also want to affirm something with listeners and start a dialogue that I hope we can have over the next few months together. Willy Lee is the first candidate for public office that we're having on the show. And the entire municipal government is up for election this November. That's every city council seat, every park board seat, the Board of Estimates and Taxation, and the mayor. I expect that we're going to talk with other candidates on the podcast and do some other coverage related to the election. But what I want to do today is affirm on the microphone that we cannot vote or elect our way to justice or vote our way to the political, economic, and social transformations that we need. We can't just vote our way to universal housing. We're not going to just vote away the police department, and we're not going to just vote open the jails. These types of changes come from organizing in our workplace, from taking action in the streets, from practicing mutual aid and meeting each other's needs, from organizing in our apartment buildings, organizing on our blocks, etc. It wasn't any city council member or elected official who won the prosecution of Derek Chauvin. It was militant, popular street actions that forced the state to do what it had never done before under the threat of ungovernability and popular rebellion. It wasn't a city councilor or the mayor who won the tenants' campaigns against apartment shop that redistributed hundreds of thousands of unjustly collected rent from that slumlord, who formed a cooperative and resisted eviction for years. That was the tenants themselves with allies and comrades ready to take action. I'll be honest that I'm still working out my thoughts on how to engage with electoral politics. But what I know for sure is that I don't want us to fall into the liberal illusion that we can elect our way to justice or that we can rely on elected officials to protect our rights to life, to housing, to clean water, etc. We have to assert those rights collectively. I just wanted to affirm that as we drop our first piece of election coverage in 2021. And that being said, I want to say thank you to Willy Lee for coming on the show. I learned a lot, and I really encourage people who live in Ward 12 to check Willy Lee out. And no matter where you are in the city, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on who's running, if and how we should engage with electoral politics, what we could gain from it, what's the potential there. Thanks for tuning in. Here's our interview with Willy Lee. I'ma work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it, work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. All right, hey, thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. I am really excited for this interview. This is our very first time ever speaking to a candidate for elected office, and that's a really exciting new area that we're going to spend a lot of time in this year. The whole city of Minneapolis, the city council, the park board, the Board of Estimate and Taxation, and the mayor are all up for election in November 2021. And I want to say welcome and thank you to Willy Lee. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Could we start? Could you just introduce yourself to our audience? Give us a sense of who you are and what position you're running for.
Yeah, I'm Willy Lee, and my pronouns are they, them, and I'm running for city council, Ward 12. Ward 12 is in the south part of Minneapolis, kind of by Lake Nokomis there. And this is not what I thought I'd be doing with my summer. And I looked around and was kind of hoping someone else would run, and to find someone who was really dedicated to doing the work of defunding the police after the year we've had here in Minneapolis. And I didn't see that. And so on the eve of the last moment to submit your name for the DFL endorsement, I decided, well, if nobody else is going to do it, I guess it should be me. And so here I am. I'm running for office. This is my first time running for office, and I got a lot to learn, but I I'm really riding off of the excitement of a lot of people who want to get this work done. And
Yeah.
so that's where I'm at, and that's who I am.
I appreciate that. One of the reasons why I chose to reach out to you first out of all candidates is I really appreciate just the candidness, the straightforward honesty on your website. It says, I'm not an experienced politician. I wasn't intending to do this, but I see an area where I could plug in on the fight. I care strongly about defunding the police and some other issues, so I'm going to throw my hat in. And I respect that, and I thought it was a good foundation for us because how I'm coming to this conversation is reworking my positions around electoral politics. One thing about this show for sure is we're a left-wing show, some sort of communists, anarchists, definitely anti-capitalists in the way we are approaching politics. And I really am skeptical of the ability of elected officials, even when they have good intentions, to really be able to make the type of structural changes that are needed. So we've been really wondering, how do we want to approach this election season? But what I also know is that while I definitely don't want to, I think what I saw happen in the last election cycles is people again kind of get that progressive hysteria in a sense, and we put all our hopes on elected officials, and then the movement loses a lot of momentum and people get frustrated, and it's kind of a repetitive cycle. So I don't want to encourage that type of thinking, but also I think we have to engage. There's obviously, it matters. There's power there to some degree. It's a part of the playing field. So that was just wanting to ground myself in this conversation too. And again, and say thank you. Could you talk about you kind of already walked us through it, but what were those deciding moments like for you? What excited you about it, and what made you afraid about it? And was there like a certain moment when you finally said, all right, I'm going for it? And how did it feel to make that decision?
Yeah, I'm like 100% there with you. Like, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we do our work. And for me, that's really been in mutual aid. That's just been in showing up and all of that until this point. And, had you asked me in my 20s, do I want to run for office? I would have said, sure. And you asked me again in my 30s, and I would have been disillusioned and say, no way.
Yeah, right.
And here I am in my 40s. I'm like, well, hell, I guess I should. and it's that progression when you start to realize that the work has to happen at all of these levels, right?
Yeah.
And right now, I'm like, I'll go ahead and put myself forward to do that work. And like, what did that really look like? It looked like that day, that day all the city council shows up at Powderhorn and they're like, oh, we got a veto-proof majority and we're going to make sure we defund these police. And then nothing, right?
Wow.
Like, there's all this noise and then there's nothing. And the charter commission's like, oh, I guess we can't. And then like we saw Minneapolis start to slide back to white comfort.
Yes.
And I was like, no, I can't do that. And so that's the thing that really got me. I had this moment, and my city council member was up there. He's never led the charge in any of this, but he was up there like, oh yeah, we're totally going to defund these police. But like that excitement, that energy, gone. And that's the thing. Like, we need to just like keep the pressure on. And if that means that we need to elect people who are not true politicians and who are going to wear, kind of come out with this on fire and right in their hearts and like doing the work, then fine. That's what we need. Right?
Absolutely.
And it's been so frustrating to feel like we were so close and then watch that all evaporate and watch people just slide back into their comfortable lives, even during a freaking pandemic and all this BS, everyone's like,
absolutely.
Oh yeah, it's all right. We got a trial, we got charges, like we even got a conviction, and like that's not all the work, and like to keep that pressure on, that's where we got to be. And it is, it's a big fight, but I think the right people have their names up. And I just wanted the 12th ward to be able to put someone in that ring and say, oh yeah, I'll carry that too. Because like, we have people on council, we have people running up for mayor who are going to do that. But, to get our numbers to win this in government, like, fine, I'll be that.
Yeah, somebody with the backbone. I really appreciate that analysis because I felt very similarly about that moment. And we actually spoke specifically about the current councilman council member for Ward 12, Andrew Johnson, because for him to hide his first years in office, make no anti-police movements, get up there in front of cameras and make that commitment and then completely blackslide on it. And even he was in the New York Times laughing about it. I thought it was so disrespectful. And I know a lot of working class people, black and brown people in Ward 12 who have been abused by the police. And for him to be so flippant and casual about it and such an opportunist, I don't want to spend too much time talking about him, but that was another reason I was excited to see your campaign, because I feel personally disrespected by that. I think he should be embarrassed. You know, it's a really slimy move, and I'm proud. It's just like we talked about the limits of electoralism, and that's real. But if they could have had a veto majority to defund the police. The city council could do that if you had 9 people with commitments and backbones and courage. So I'm curious. Like, that's another thing I found very refreshing about your page. Is it says right up there, Willy wants to defund the police. And you just described that was your key issue. I've seen a lot of people back off of that language, you know, and really get caught up in this right word backlash after last summer. And I was so glad to see your goal up there. Can you talk more about like, why is that issue so close to your heart? Why was that the main issue? And maybe talk about how you see that going. Like, why are you so committed to defunding the police?
Yeah, you know, there was all of that talk about what the right word was, especially when people were using the word abolish and people just freaked out, you know, and then everyone started jumping on defund and now people are freaking out about that. And I think that there are a couple things to this, right? Like, we've seen places that do a really good job of saying, okay, so mental health resources should go out there and it should be trained, de-escalated counselors, not people with guns, right? And we see that in city after city. But the fact of the matter is, you can do that, but until you reduce the contact area between the police and people of color, it's not getting any better,
Absolutely.
Right? And so you can't do both. You can't continue to fund the police like it is and expect it to be okay, and then provide all these other services that are hitting those other parts. You know, you have to cut that surface area. You have to bring down the number of cops with guns on the street. You got to cut down all of that power that they have right now, and just kind of, you know, in their union and their solidarity, we need to meet it with our solidarity.
Absolutely.
We are taking that down. We're taking these parts of your job, you know, your time, but also and of your budget and of your head count.
And let's get those bombs back too, and the rocket launchers you got in the big tanks. You don't need them either. Yeah.
You don't need none of that. None of that. Like, that is ridiculous. I
think that's a really powerful thing to hear candidates saying, because there's the, you know, not retooling, but replacing with positive services, like you're saying. And that is, I think, easier for maybe people who are maybe a little more middle class or white people or liberal people to accept that. But it has to be paired with the defunding, because, and from just speaking from my perspective as somebody where I see the limitations, is that we can't think that defunding is going to happen without the street movement on the ground. And because the cops aren't going to take that lane down. We all need to play our roles, but that's public money, hundreds of millions of dollars, which is not keeping us safe. They continue to get higher budgets while they commit violence, and they do nothing about the violence in our communities. So it's just that, to me, seems like a no-brainer that, like, let's move that money to productive things and let's get these cops out of here, you know? So kudos to you for coming out so strong on that point.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to talk about some other issues, if that's cool, and we'll keep looping back because they're all connected. You also talked about houselessness, you know, the housing crisis. So many of our neighbors and relatives sleeping outside in the brutal Minnesota conditions, being criminalized. Where do you know, I see that as one of the issues that you talk about on your campaign page. Can you talk more about that, like how that issue impacts you and how you want to address it if you're elected?
Yeah, let's start right at criminalization, and then we'll back into some other issues. I think, you know, central to all of this, you know, when we don't know what to do in government, I guess they just throw cops at the damn situation. And right now we see encampments, and what happens is like, oh, well, people are upset. And so we throw cops out there to throw away all their stuff and beat the shit out of people. And like, that ain't the way to go. You know, that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the people they kicked out. It doesn't help the neighbors that are living there, nothing. And that's the wrong thing to do. And that's definitely part of like figuring out what parts of ordinance, what parts of government can we just change so that those things are no longer criminalized, you know, like sleeping out. Let's just make that not criminalized. Now, we still want to get people housing, right?
Right.
But let's just take that first cut right off the bat and just be like, okay, this whole like reacting with policing and reacting with laws to just make it so that people can't survive in the ways that they need to. That ain't it. And so
absolutely.
Yeah. So we start there, right? And then the next thing is, and some of this is already happening. All right. Like some of this is really happening through some real great things on this, you know, from both like official, like charities and organizations, like some of that's happening. Right. And then there's the work that just people are doing. Like there's the mutual aid. There's just all this work that people are putting into it. And that's great. But what we have to do is figure out where are all those gaps that people fall apart. Like, where does it all fall apart? Right. Like we got all these programs, and it's just like, oh, well, this family, you know, can't go together to one place and they don't want to split up. You know, it's like, well, we found a place for the mom, and, you know, but her boyfriend can't go anywhere. And like, there's no place that's going to take the kids and the dog unless, and it's just like, and it comes up to all of these problems, and we just throw our hands up, right? And that's not right. We have to figure out ways to say, okay, let's get people housed, first, and then figure out what happens next, right? Let's take that first step and say, okay, we're going to create some bit of safe housing that's just going to take anyone in whatever configurations, and kind of and really not try and pin that in with rules, right? It's really hard to get clean, especially if you don't want to, right? And it's just like, okay, but like, let's get you housed and figure out how we reduce harm, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and you can't do that until you're safe, right? And like, to say the rules have to be like this and you have to be clean to be in, like, that isn't going to happen for a lot of people. And so let's start with the real compassionate thing first: housing, food, and then let's work with people as like people and not like as rules and bureaucracy, and say, okay, so what do you need? How do we get there? There's so much money in this place. And we can do this. It's just, we have to say that that's more important than all of this other stuff.
Absolutely. Yes. I couldn't agree more. You know, just to affirm some of the points that you made, you know, seeing that a lot of people could, you know, COVID, people who were living on the streets were keeping each other safe and setting up the best situations that they could manage. And they could have been fine if the state wasn't attacking them, you know, and it's like, really, it's repression, and it's criminalizing and punishing people for being poor. So if you have to work against that. That's what I hear you identifying, both at the street level and housing people without all these barriers. You know, I know a lot of people who work for the city or who have high-paying jobs who are functioning chemical users, and nobody's taking away their housing. You know, it's just the way that we patronize and criminalize, you know, poor and oppressed people. That's got to stop. So to have somebody, you know, in one of those positions with that attitude would be encouraging. And then I want to jump in. This is, I guess, taking us away from the issues, but this just made me think of something, you know, where you're talking about bringing like a human ethic of solidarity and compassion into the state, you know, which is the opposite of those things. So you got an uphill battle in front of you. If you're elected, how do you plan to care for yourself, or how do you plan to keep that spirit fresh, you know? And like, I like that energy I feel from you right now. And I'm, you know, what I've seen from people who get close in there, that they feed on that, you know? So how do you plan on caring for yourself if you get elected?
You know, I am really grateful that here in Minneapolis, we have a huge family of choice, and I got so many great people in my corner who keep me fueled, you know?
Hell yeah.
I'm married, and my wife and I have a great little house down here in the 12th. But we have so many people we count as family in this town. A handful of them we're actually related to, but most of them we aren't.
Yeah.
And their work really pushes me, and their ability to just like break things down and just like help me understand where they're coming from and help me process the stuff that I'm working on. Like that's food for my soul. And I'm grateful I found that. Many people are out here in this world, and they find a couple of people, or maybe they don't even find anyone who really shares that and can really carry that load and that community. And I'm super grateful for that.
Yeah, I'm glad that you have that also. That's beautiful. We all need it. And I think that translates into like the approach to governance as well, or holding that seat, because it's not just like the collective care for you, but also the collective stewardship of that position. That's like resources and power. And I think the more it's collectivized, probably the better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing. I think, I laugh about this, but I really feel like some people are in politics because they want to be elected and they want the job. I got something I want to do. And if we get this done, if I get in there and we get this done, maybe there's some other things I want to do, but like, it's not about me, you know, and it's about like, I'm willing to take this part in the fight. And there's so many different parts. And then, there's the parts in mutual aid. There's the parts like showing up at the supply depots. There's the people working in the encampments. There's all of that, right? People holding down George Floyd Square, all of that. We need it all, right? And thinking about how I can do this, I'm like, well, fine. I understand enough about politics and I know enough people that like, maybe I'll take a shot at this. It's kind of a long shot, but I'm willing to do it because it's time. Like we came so close and it felt so real, right? And like to know, like to get that feeling of, oh, well, everyone's super excited and there were some press conferences and a bunch of news and like everyone out there and the rest of the country's like, oh yeah, you defunded your police. I'm like, shit,
right. I wish.
I'm not even close.
Yeah.
And so like, we got to do that work, right? And I'm willing to do it. I mean, there's a part of me that's not very excited about the job because it's a lot of meetings with some insufferable people.
Yeah.
But I'm willing to put that energy into the fight. And I'm hoping that my community kind of lifts me up and keeps me going and, that we keep each other fed.
Absolutely. Yeah, that seems like a very good perspective to have coming into that seat. One, like, you don't seem like you got the vapors, we just want to be down there with the well-dressed people. And it's not a fun assignment. I've seen, people go into them type of positions and not be prepared for it. So it's good to hear that you're grounded and and very excited to see somebody challenge Andrew Johnson because we could do so much better. A big issue going to be on the ballot this year, potentially, we got to fight to get it on the ballot, is rent control. There could be some ballot measures, and we'll do shows to talk about the details of that process, but just broadly, where do you stand on the issue of rent control?
I am 100% for it.
Awesome.
Our lousy mayor was talking about how to market this and the market that, and I'm like, no, that is not the space we need, And so that criticism from the market perspective, they're like, oh, well, if you control rent and people aren't making lots of money, they're not going to do improvements to the place. It's like, you know what? Government can require you to make those improvements. There is already a set of codes that say you have to heat a house to this and you have to do this, and like there's all this code about like what's a safe rental. And it's like, great, let's just jack up what a safe rental is and make sure we control these prices. Because right now, what's happening is people with too much money are buying up all the real estate and the prices are going ridiculous. And then they all control the rental market. And as the tighter the rental market gets and the fewer people that have it, like the prices go up and it's just not affordable to live in Minneapolis.
It's not.
And you look at median incomes in Minneapolis and then you look at median rent and you're like, how do you make that happen?
You can't.
And you can't. Exactly. You can't. And government has a role in this. To say that government doesn't have a role in rent control and government doesn't have a role in setting what those safe requirements are for housing and for rental housing. Like, that's absurd. That is the role of government.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate that. And, you know, when you really look at the relationship with the city government to real estate capital, you realize it's completely subservient. There's no public sector. It's complete austerity. And they can get away with those. The real estate lobby can make one weak threat and the city's already apologizing. And they're on the same team, you know. So to hear you not cower in the face of that is very impressive. And one thing I was hoping to do, you know, is just talk a bit about policy options. And I think what I'd like to hear people say when the real estate lobby says, okay, well, if there's rent control, then we're not gonna build any more buildings, or we're gonna sell out our buildings, or we're gonna stop doing repairs. And I think not only, one answer to that is with our regulatory code, say if you want to do business here, you have to meet these standards. And if you don't want to meet these standards, good, leave. And then we can replace that private ownership of the housing stock with public ownership, you know. And if they don't want to build no buildings, good, because we should be building the best public housing the world's ever seen right here in Minneapolis right now, you know. So
Right.
Even taking that, we don't have to, not only do we not have to cower from the private real estate capital, we should be looking to bully them out of the market, like claim more space for people. That's why there's a houselessness issue. People don't have homes because big capital has come, bought up they're hoarding it. They're keeping people out. This summer when there was people sleeping on the street, there was thousands of empty units in the city. It's inhumane. And yeah, the government should be putting them people in them houses.
Right. And if they're like, oh, if you do this, we're going to sell out. I'm like, fine, we buy it.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, beautiful. Sign me up. That's exactly the response to that. I love to hear that. Can you talk a little bit more about your housing policy, you know, and your perspective on housing? What I've seen on your website was definitely an affirmation about needing more housing and all types of housing. Can you talk about that? Like, why do you name different types of housing in your policy, and what type of housing do you think we need?
So there's a lot of things that happen in the housing sector that I think, you know, have been positive in the last couple of years, but I think they've been limited. And so for the longest time, Minneapolis had this whole set of codes that restricted who could live together, right? And so you had to be related to like live in certain parts of the city, right? And like that changed in, I think 2017, might be 2019. I don't remember the number on that, but that changed, right? But what's happening right now is that we have types of housing that are legal in certain parts, like certain zoning, right?
Yeah.
But not legal everywhere. So here in the 12th Ward, where most of the place is these single family houses, you see this pushback of like, oh, well, you couldn't really have a boarding room, like a boarding house here, right? Or you couldn't really have like a place where a whole bunch of people, like a community of choice chooses to live together here, like, because it's not zoned for that. Right. And I want to lift those restrictions so that the whole city can have these vibrant communities where people can live, and these are affordable options. You know, when we start thinking about like boarding houses or single room occupancy, like we have these different types of housing that are zoned for certain places, but like to open that up and say, okay, we can build those throughout the city, and that they're not restricted just to like, you know, to places that border commerce, to places that feel poor or whatever. Like that's absurd. And like, yeah, sure, the market's going to make that really hard to do in a lot of places. Like to see that like at Lake Harriet, like that's going to be a real expensive buy. And so it's probably not going to happen. But like to open that up so that if people who live there, you know, and people who have capital decide that that's the way they want to live, like let's not have zoning push back on that. Right.
Yeah.
And so and I think like those are a whole set of issues where there's just like this lack of equity, you know, and the 2040 plan kind of gets to this, and they talk a little bit about like really kind of lifting some of those, but we saw a ton of pushback, especially here in like the 12th and the 13th. And that's just, it's absurd, you know, and we just need to lift that.
Yeah, it is. You know, I'm interested. I agree. In terms of like, I think those types of zoning restrictions, which we know, you know, are rooted in the legacy of restricted racial covenants, a lot of them, and the way that the city was planned to have working class areas where there's rental housing in one district and then single family homes in another district. That was all planned and facilitated so that the housing market would develop along the lines that it has. And I'm in favor of lifting those restrictions to allow apartment buildings to be built across the city, to allow for different types of housing, single room housing, different cooperative options, and to treat the city equitably that way. My issue becomes, or why I find myself often critical of people who lead with zoning, or I see a lot of times people reducing the situation with housing down to supply and demand, and that if you just lifted zoning restrictions, that somehow that would create housing equity. And I think what you have to do is combine the loosening of those restrictions, the removal of those restrictions, and socialist housing policy, public investment, rent control, public housing, and because if you just leave it to the market's not going to build for poor people. It doesn't have an incentive to do it. So I think a lot of times people even co-opted the racial equity language and story of the housing market, of the zoning restrictions, and then use that to push just another capitalist plan that really didn't have working class people or people of color in mind when they created it. It's kind of like a slick way. I think I was pretty critical of the 2040 process in that way.
No, I totally hear you. And right now we have this benchmark for like affordable units and new construction, and that number is not affordable, right? Like, It's so far from this whole idea of socialist housing that it's laughable. Right. It's just laughable. That number is not a number that like your average Minneapolis resident can meet. And we have to bring that number down. We have to look at all the options for that. And I do think like you're really onto something about like how do we figure out how to use our collectivism, right, to buy into some models that haven't been there before. And some of that can happen through government. Some of that's going to happen through, nonprofits and whatever. But I support all of it. And I think like there's just so much work to be done there. And you can't build a world-class city without making sure that everyone can live here, because, it takes all kinds to have a world-class city. And it's not just your fancy people with suits and whatever, but like we all love to have a place where you can go and get coffee. And I know that doesn't pay enough to like meet your affordable housing in a brand new condo building. And that ain't going to happen.
No, I hear you. That you're speaking to a lot of I grew up in Northeast Minneapolis and just really have seen the city change over my life. The city I'm an adult in is a very different city than it was when I was growing up. And, but I love it also, you know what I'm saying? And I want to participate and I want to be here and I want the people who raised me, to be here and to thrive. The people, so yes, it's...
and like, how do we lift everyone up, right? Like we see these neighborhoods just start to gentrify because like the prices keep going up and like the character of the neighborhood changes so dramatically. And like, then you're left in this pickle. Like, let's say you owned there and you see the prices keep going up and up and up, but like, you're not keeping up because wages aren't keeping up. And it's just like, well, at what point do you sell and you leave? And then the gentrification just gets worse. And like, we need to be able to bring everyone up, not just housing, but wages and like all of it. And
certainly.
And we just see so much money just escaping to the top that it's just unworkable. It's just unworkable.
It really is. I got a couple more questions. I wanted to ask you about your transportation philosophy, or kind of your, that's another issue in the city, and you talk about transportation beyond cars. So what does that look like? And how do we become a more pedestrian and bike friendly city, and why should we?
Yeah. So let's break this down for a couple of different reasons. Like, you can go like to the full, like I shop at the co-op progressive end of this thing and be like, oh, well, the world's burning and we have to do something, which is true. Right. Facts. We need to do something about that. And so like that's a perfectly reasonable way to do that. But I also think about like how expensive it is to keep and maintain a car. and how that really, like, our reliance on that really gets people into some really bad situations sometimes. And so, like, your access to transportation cuts off your access to a job, and then that really jeopardizes your housing. And it's this cycle, right? And to be able to provide a whole network of ways that you can get around that can mitigate some of those things. So maybe you still choose to own a car, but like the bus is a great backup when your car is being a piece of crap, right? And it's just like, oh, I just can't this week. But like, what if the busing system and the transit system with trains, and like, what if all of that is robust enough that you can get to your shift on time? Like when your shift is over, you don't have to wait an hour to catch the next bus home or whatever. Like get our headways down, right? The amount of time between trips, and like really get it so that it feels real and it feels possible and it doesn't feel like another burden.
Yeah.
But like cars and buses, like that's that first level that a lot of people think about. But then there's a whole nother set of things, right? Like, I love to bicycle, but not like as a sport. Like I just really find it enjoyable to ride a bike to a place I need to be later.
Me
right?
too.
Like as transportation, I think it's just the greatest. Like
it
to be
really
out
is.
there in the world and like,
you feel so good. When I'm driving around in a car compared to a bike, I love being on a bike. My mood is better. It's just, it really is, it improves my quality of life for sure.
Right. But like we think about that, and like a lot of people think about that in like bike paths around the lakes and whatever, or like, a separated lane here and there. But like thinking about how we make a complete system where you feel like you could bike anywhere, like, and you're safe biking anywhere, and that becomes an option, not only helps you with like the people who can ride a regular bicycle, but then you think about the accessibility when you start thinking about electronic bicycles, or you start thinking about like motorized scooters, people in wheelchairs. Like there are all these other ways to get around that don't involve being in a car that we need a better network for. And right now what we have is like, we have a patchwork of like recreational stuff, a little bit of stuff that like connects the city okay enough.
Yeah.
But we don't have a complete vision of that. And when it comes winter, it all falls apart. Like I like winter biking, but like sometimes you get to that intersection and the way the plow leaves the snow, it's just like, I can't get out. I gotta go like 2 more blocks to find a place someone shoveled so I can actually get to the place I want to go to.
Stuck
and the
in
same
a tunnel.
For like riding the bus. It's just like that bus stop, like I'm in my 40s and still able. And so like I can climb over a 3-foot snowbank to get into the bus, but can my 80-year-old neighbor?
Right.
No. And like, okay, so I shovel the bus stop by our house for our 80-year-old neighbor because I know she takes it all the time. And like, we do that. Like a couple of neighbors and I are like, we just make sure it's done, right? But like, that should be the city's job. Like the sidewalk is transportation as much as the street is. And why can't we clear those? Even if we start with just the bus stops, right? And the intersections, so that getting somewhere is possible. Like that's a good start. If we could do all the sidewalks, that'd be the dream, right?
Yeah.
And like we think about that because like that sidewalk is the first part of most trips, right? Besides the car, the sidewalk is the first part of most trips. Whether that's I'm going to the bus, I'm just going to walk down to the grocery store or whatever. And like thinking about that, that part of like the network, but then also thinking about like, how do we create these communities that are really like lively and support those like small grocery stores where you can run and go grab the 2 other things, and like support like the neighborhood bar and all of that so that you can go get something to eat. And like all of those things really lead to these vibrant neighborhoods. We live in the city because we want to live in the city, like they got Blaine over there.
Exactly.
I don't need a car-centric, no sidewalk, whatever. And if I wanted that, I could buy any number of houses today out there for half the cost of this house that I'm sitting in right now.
It's funny that you say that because I got family that lives in the northern suburbs, and I realize how much I need to walk. Like walking is my life. It's for my mental health, my physical health, and being able to walk around the city is just really fundamental to me. And then I go out there and I'm like, damn, it'd be hard to walk out here. There's not the infrastructure there, and that's it's a real issue. It's a real quality of life issue, and I like that vision that you're describing. What I want to be able to do is walk down to my local organic weed farm and then pick my little plants and go to the coffee shop. That's my vision for the city one day.
Right. Like we need that too. That's another part of decriminalization and defunding that we need too, right?
Yeah.
And like one of the things I just want to have a little detour on this whole decriminalization versus like legalization thing.
Please, thank you.
Because like I think a lot of times people who haven't really thought through these issues is like, you know what we really need to do? We'll just make it legal and we'll slap like 800 laws around it. Like, so if you look at Michigan, it's just like, okay, Michigan's like, oh yeah, we legalized, but like basically to be able to grow, you need a crap ton of money and you need all this regulation and like basically only rich white people can get in.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
They call it weed for a reason.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like, it's not that hard to grow and it's great, you know? And so like, I think like the whole notion of decriminalization is like, let's start with like, let's remove the restrictions and let things happen. You know, sure, you're still going to get those like hydroponic, big dollar, whatever operations, but like, we need to start looking at it, not from a regulation standpoint where we make it so that only the capitalists, only the people with like a butt ton of money can get this done.
Yes.
To something that's just free, right?
Thank you.
It's just freedom, right? And the same thing happened. Like we talk about that in drugs, and like I also talk about that in sex work. You know, like right now you start thinking about like, okay, so when you decriminalize, that's one thing, right? Freedom.
Right.
And then when you start putting all these rules in it, all those rules are other places where you interface with the justice, you know, air quotes as hard as you can. Basically, that's when you interface with the cops.
With the state, right.
And like with the state. And that's what I don't want, right?
Right.
Like we talk about defunding and like defunding can't happen without talking about decriminalization, which is completely different than legalization.
Yes. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. And for our listeners, and that's such an important framework. And, you know, as a cannabis enthusiast, I don't want it like legalization means creating the legal categories to make it a capitalist commodity. You know, that's not a healthy thing for people. The way what you just described, decriminalization is freedom. Let people grow the plant. Let people study the plant. Let people smoke the plant in peace. Stay out of their business, you know. Encourage people, you know, treat it like medicine. And I think for sex work too, get your laws off of people's bodies and stop punishing people in various different ways. I really appreciate that framework. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Could you tell our listeners what is this? Another big ballot issue this year is going to be the Strong Mayor Amendment. From my understanding, the Charter Commission has proposed this. Could you help our listeners understand what that is and what your position is on that?
All right. So right now in the city of Minneapolis, most departments report to the city council. So there's a head of the department. That person reports to the city council, with one big exception. The police chief reports to the mayor. And so what we have right now is the Charter Commission is like, oh, well, it's just too hard to do business. And like, we saw this whole mess in the city. And so what we should do is make all of the city departments report to the mayor. And the city council can, you know, tweak the budget and do some things like that. But like everyone reports to the mayor. Well, the failures of this year were all on the police. Yeah. The one place that reports to the mayor. And what you have is you have a system where one elected mayor who might be awful has too much power. One of the things I really like about the current system, and a system that brings control back to the council, not just because I'm trying to be on the council, but it's that it evens it out. Someone from North has power there. Someone from every one of these wards has power there. And that's more important than this whole idea of centralizing around one mayor. Like, yeah. I really want, like, I got someone I really want for mayor right now. And if she's the mayor, like, that's going to be all right. And like, I feel like we'd make it through in a strong mayor system, but like, I don't want to rely on that. I don't trust government to continue to elect great mayors who believe in the people, you know? Yeah. Too many mayors have not been that. And I don't want to live in a city that all of that stuff has to go through one person, and one person who could win just on the people in the 13th ward, the 12th ward, the rich wards, and the real estate money. Like, I
Yes.
don't want that. I want to make sure that, like, all the city departments have a real accountability to all parts of the city.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that to us. I've been learning a little bit more about it. And I want to bring up one issue just as maybe something for everybody to think about. So another thing that I'm wrestling with in terms of the city elections is, my understanding is like what that would mean then, that all departments report to the mayor, that the city council couldn't even give staff directives. So like to get this rent control thing bubbling and moving, usually what has to happen is the city council person has to direct a staff at CPED and say, start studying this problem, or we want you to look at this issue, the potentials for this issue. So the city council then can give this staff at the city council or at the city direction. And this would mean that they could no longer even do that. And what I've learned in my years organizing in Minneapolis is that a huge, largely invisible part of the power structure is the city staff. In particular, the professional managerial class that works downtown. So there's many different staff at the city, right? There's the people who go out there and shovel the walks, do all that labor. And then there's the people who work in CPED, the people who work in all the departments downtown. And that is a huge block of power that's, even under the system that we have right now, is very undemocratic. We have very little control over what happens there. And for example, the director of CPED, before he was the previous director of CPED, before he was director, worked at private real estate firm that was very heavily involved in the gentrification of the warehouse district, the North Loop. These are highly paid staff who are very deeply invested in capitalist orthodoxy and the private real estate market. And I think if we want to make some of the changes that we want to see in terms of more public housing, robust rent control, we're going to have to contend with those city departments. So I guess that's just maybe something to leave us all with. I don't know if you've had those experiences as well, if you're thinking about that going into your term, but I think the strong mayor proponent would even exacerbate that situation. And
absolutely. Yeah. So, I'm kind of new to the race, but I got the chance to screen with AFSCME, the city employees union.
Nice.
And, it was really great to talk to rank and file because, like, I worked at the U and I worked in a state. And what I know is that people pass laws and they don't know how the work gets done. Right. And so then down there where the work gets done, you're like, well, how am I going to make these two laws fit together? Or like, didn't you already know we already audit this 3 different ways? And like these ideas from government often create the bureaucracy, whether they mean to or not, they create the bureaucracy. And they're often, like you say, supported by capitalism and the whole notion of like, you need money to run for office and you need, do you need these powerful people behind you? And like, I'm trying to leave all that behind and say, you know what? In the end, it's about counting votes. And if we can get this done by talking to people, like people with power, but not necessarily capital, like we got the power of the vote, we got the power of solidarity, like we got power, like let's manifest that in ways that can help us exert that control, and then start thinking about how does our relationship with city staff from the council really start talking to the people who know what's going on, not this managerial class that you talk about, but like the real people who are doing the work and understanding what the needs are of the residents of this city. And like we need to make that change because too often it's just too separate, and like that whole managerial class is really coming from that land of donors, that land of wealth, and that land of privilege. And we need to talk to the people who get the work done.
Thank you for saying that. And I appreciate that because I want to affirm that I'm not talking about the workers, the laborers who are really doing it. We run the city, both public sector and everywhere we're working. I really wanted, my criticism was for that managerial class. So thank you for that. All right. I have really thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I just want to end with a question about Ward 12. What's some of your favorite spots in Ward 12? If somebody's visiting the ward, where might you direct them?
So let's talk about 2 things I love about Ward 12. I love down here by the lakes. You know, I live right by Lake Hiawatha and the creek, and it's just like it's this beautiful, peaceful little slice of nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm grateful that the park board thought so many years ago to kind of keep that public and not surround it with rich people's houses. And I love that. But if you're visiting and it's not a pandemic and you need something to eat, I love the Bull's Horn. I think it's the best bar around. Great burgers, good, you know, not a long tap list, but it's just well selected. The French fries there are fantastic. If you're vegetarian, there's good veggie burger. Great fried chicken. It's my favorite.
I've never been there. Where's that?
You gotta go. It's like right behind the light rail station. So it's at 46th Street and 34th Ave. And they got a small patio, but it's nice enough. It used to be the Sunrise, a total dive bar. And the guy who owns Sandcastle and runs Esker Grove and the Walker and some other fancy places, like bought it and said, I want to own like the best dive bar. And he's done it. And I love it. And during the pandemic, we've gotten takeout there once a week for the whole year. But I got to say, before the pandemic, we were probably going close to once a week. It is my favorite place.
Nice. Now I got I'm always trying to figure out where we want to eat, you know, so now I got another idea.
Yeah, you like to ride your bike, and it's a great ride. Like the entry points to ride in there are just so good. So many too.
Sweet. You know, I think I do. I think I can picture in my mind now, and it intrigues me when I drive past it.
Yeah.
Could you, just one last question about the ward? Could you kind of give us a sense, or maybe let's see if I can sketch Ward 12. So it's east of Cedar, right?
Yeah.
So if you start on Cedar Ave is the east boundary or the west boundary, and then you got to be south of 34th.
It's not a straight line there, but it's like,
okay.
I think it's 34th for part of it and 35th for the other part, maybe 36th. I don't remember.
Okay.
But
yeah. So, but it's like
straight.
So it starts in the 30s in Cedar and then cuts all the way to the river, right? Mm-hmm. And then south down to Lake Nokomis and
down to the border.
Yeah. Okay. So some of my favorite river spots, you know, mm-hmm. I smoke a lot of blunts in Ward 12. Yeah, I gotta say.
God bless the river, right?
Yes, indeed. Hey, thank you so much for joining us, Willy Lee. Where can our listeners tap in and learn more about your campaign?
You know, I got a website at willylee.org, and I'm on Twitter as Willy for 12th. And I'm okay about my email. And I'm hoping to step up this whole Twitter thing. I love Twitter. It's just I'm having a hard time separating my personal Twitter from my campaign Twitter. And, let's be real. I'm running it as trying to be as real as possible. And so if you want to creep on my regular Twitter, I'm Advice Pig. I always wanted to write an advice column when I was in my 20s. And so I grabbed that handle. Nice. And if you want to creep on my Instagram and see the beautiful sights at Ward 12, that's Willy Lee MN. And you can see my cats, my bikes, and what I've been eating.
Nice. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us. You've heard from Willy Lee running for Ward 12. We're about defunding the police and transforming society. Thanks for tuning in. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you're funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep them coming. Bands building up